So welcome everybody. Today is Passover, so I'm in Egypt. And I'm hoping that some of you will be able to join us this evening for the community Seder. And I know some of you attended a Seder yesterday. So if you can stand too, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll record it too, so you can watch it at your leisure. So again, any questions before we start? We have a lot of material to cover today. And by the way, I never intended to have you read 8 chapters from one week to the next. I should have said this, and I did say it to a few people that I met with individually, that you would read a little bit at a time. And I mean, some people maybe don't look ahead at their syllabus. I always used to look ahead and get everything read before the semester started, but that's me. Anyway, so please don't feel that if you haven't read it all that you're behind. Just read it at your leisure. It's it's a short history of the Jewish people, but it's dense, because it's like everything crammed together. So just read a little bit at a time and take your time, and you don't have to have it done by a certain time. Just it's there for background. We're going to try to cover everything from the biblical period to the rabbinic period, which basically we're talking about something like 1800 BCE to 70 CE, a couple thousand years or so, in less than 2 hours. All right, so we're gonna try to get through it. If not, we'll have to pick it up next time. All right. The first thing we have to pay attention to is the fact that the Bible is a kind of history, but it's not history as in, a formal academic discipline. So there's a difference between Jewish memory and Jewish history. So Torah tells sacred theological history and recounts the national myth of the Jewish people. Myth being, okay, maybe some of it's true and maybe some of it isn't. Again, factually, some of it is not true. In terms of the deeper truths, there's deep truth in the stories. Torah stories were passed down from generation to generation in the form of myth, legend, folklore, poems, and songs before these stories were committed to writing. So, there was an oral tradition. So as you know, I'm sure you've played telephone when you were kids, maybe you still play it. And you know that as soon as you tell somebody a story, they may not completely hear it right. They have their own filters. By the time it goes around the table, it's a whole different story by the time it gets there. So we have to keep that in mind. And what happened was there are all these stories that were told from generation to generation and eventually written down and edited together. But it's a long, long process. So Torah presents a rich tapestry of the pre-modern collective memory of the Jewish people. So again, it's placed in a particular time in history, which is important to think about. Because, it doesn't necessarily apply to who we are today. We've discussed that. So academic history is based on hard facts, archaeological evidence, artifacts, ancient sources, etc. And it's got a sober quality and strives to be objective. Nothing is objective. We know that. We know that from our history books that privileged, the white male, no offense to anybody here, but that's what it did. It left out the stories of a lot of other people. So that's the need for ethnic studies. So Yerushalmi wrote a book about historical memory. And he says memory should not be confused with history. History seeks data and explanations. Memory seeks meaning. Now that's the real key here. We're talking about looking for meaning. We're not talking about looking for specific, real facts. We're looking for what it is to be a human being in this world and what it means to be a Jewish human being. History walks in earthen shoes. Memory is spun from the soul. We create history. Memory creates us. And this is really significant, especially today that it's Passover, because Passover is about memory, is about preserving that memory. We all know what happens if we don't repeat a story over and over again. It gets lost, it gets forgotten. Perhaps we need to admit that the story is not history, but myth, not in the sense of not true, but rather in expressing a truth that is not necessarily historical. In other words, Maybe it didn't exactly happen, but it had meaning for us. Yes, Stephen, some of the stories have facts in them, absolutely. It wasn't made out of whole cloth, but we have to remember that not all of it is factually true, but that doesn't mean it isn't true on some other level. All right, now this, I don't expect you to be able to follow this right here. You're going to get a copy of this in a PDF after the class, but this kind of gives you a history of Israel, really, from the year 2000 BCE to the year 2000 CE. And you can see from these yellow lines that these were all the different empires that took over. If you look at, see, oh, this map shows you where all the tribes settled, but it doesn't show you that Israel is between Mesopotamia, which is over in this area here, Egypt, which is down here. So this area of Canaan is on the route from one empire to the other. So you had people coming in and taking over. It was a route to taking over the rest of the area. And Canaan was just on the way. So you have Egyptian, Jebusite, Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, Persian, this is Greek. And then finally Roman, all these different empires that took over. And then in blue, you see short periods of time here. This is when Israel was an independent kingdom under the House of David. And here under the Hasmoneans, that short period here when the Maccabees won. And it isn't all the way down here until 1948 that Israel becomes an independent entity once again. And in between, you have all of these other, the green are various Arabic empires that have taken over. And you see all these different kingdoms that have taken over. So there's only been 3 periods here, up here during the House of David, the Hasmoneans, and down here that Israel has been actually an independent polity. I want to give you a little branch of the family tree so that you get a sense of who all these patriarchs are that we're going to talk about in a moment. So Abraham is, the original patriarch, and he was essentially married to 2 women, Sarah and Hagar. Hagar and Abraham had Ishmael, and Ishmael becomes the patriarch of Islam. Abraham and Sarah have Isaac, and he becomes the next patriarch. Sarah is the matriarch. Isaac marries Rebekah and has 2 children, Jacob and Esau. They're twins. Jacob becomes the next patriarch. By the way, what you will see consistently is that it's the younger male who becomes the next patriarch rather than the older one. The older one is supposed to inherit twice as much as the younger one, but that's constantly reversed in the Torah and in the rest of the Bible as well. Jacob has 2 wives, although he actually has concubines as well, and he has a whole bunch of kids with them, which are not indicated in this particular graph. I found a really wonderful family tree that I copied and put up, and then all of a sudden I saw at the bottom it says something about Jesus lives, and I thought, well, that's not really appropriate. So, but they had a slightly better one than this one because it included the 2 concubines. But in any event, his 2 main wives were Leah and Rachel, who are the other matriarchs. Hagar is not a matriarch, but it's Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Rachel are the matriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the patriarchs. So Jacob, with his various wives, had all these kids, 12 sons, plus a daughter, Dinah, who should have been on here too. As I said, the one that they made, the Christians made a better one than this, but this is the best one I could find that was already made. Okay, so these are the 12 sons, and they become the tribes of Israel. I don't expect you to memorize this right now. I just want you to know that when you get your PDF, you will have this, and it will help you a little bit, I think, follow the stories. So the beginning of Jewish history or Jewish memory is Abraham and Sarah. So Abraham and his family come from Ur of the Chaldeans. He and his father moved to Haran, which is, I believe, in Syria today. And his father dies there, and eventually Abraham is called to go to the land of Canaan. We've looked at that text. Basically, God says, you're going to be the father of a great nation. Go to the place that I'm going to tell you. And Abraham goes, and he takes his wife. Now, their names are Abram and Sarai. It gets changed later with the covenant, and they become Abraham and Sarah. So what's the difference between Abram and Abraham? Anybody know?
Ha.
Okay, what does that represent? It's a hey in Hebrew. I asked some 6-year. Yeah.
It's I believe it's the letter for God.
Exactly. It's a letter for God. So once they have a covenant with God, God gets incorporated into their name. Now, I did ask some 6-year-olds what the difference between Abram and Abraham was, and one of the kids said Ham, which is true in English, but not true in Hebrew. So as I said, Abraham was born in the city of Ur. He's the son of Terah, an idol merchant. Now that is something that was put in by the Midrash. That's not in the Torah, and he questioned the faith of his father. Again, that is not in the Torah. Okay, that's a whole Midrash about Abraham who, says these idols mean nothing. And the reason that the Midrash says that about Abraham is because otherwise, why did God pick Abraham? Of all the people he could have picked, why did he pick Abraham? Because Abraham already knew that idols were not real. So his wife Sarai was barren, and that's a whole theme throughout the Bible. There are barren women who, of course, eventually give birth, thanks to God. And so in those days, believe it or not, there was such a thing as surrogate motherhood. So she offers her maidservant Hagar as a wife, and they have a son named Ishmael. But then when Abram is 100 and Sarai is 90, God promises them a son. As I said, the names are changed, and Sarah then has a son named Isaac, which means in Hebrew, Yitzchak, meaning laughter, because both of them are so old that they basically laugh at the idea that, oh, we're going to have a kid at this age, ha ha. But as we know, God can do anything. Then we know about the test that was given where, look how close he is to killing the kid in this particular rendition. In fact, in this rendition, and I don't know who the painter is, but the angel not only has to say Abraham, Abraham twice, but has to actually put his hand on the hand with the knife to stop him. So, again, literally, this is about faith in God, right? We talked about how there are a lot of other ways of understanding this, but yeah, literally, faith in God rewarded. Okay, now we skipped all the way to Jacob because Isaac, who is the son, as you can imagine, after what happened to him, he is not exactly, a completely well person, emotionally. And his wife, Rebecca, is much stronger than he is. And she's the one who has twins, Jacob and Esau. And God says to her, and she actually has an encounter with God, which is rare for women, that your kids are going to fight, but the older will serve the younger, Esau being the older twin. And Esau was Isaac's favorite because he was a good hunter. He liked the game that Esau would bring home. Jacob was Rebecca's favorite. And he married Rachel and Leah, had 12 sons and a daughter, Dinah. And then the tribes are formed from those 12. So this is in the context, the story of the patriarchs and matriarchs is in the context of God creating the world and God realizing, ooh, I goofed, which is interesting, right? I mean, God would realize that God had made a mistake. Like, God creates the world. It's a mess. Human beings are awful. So God decides, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to destroy the world, but I'm going to save one guy, Noah, because he's the most righteous person in his generation. And the flood is going to destroy the rest of the world. And so that's God's attempt at trying to rectify the mistake. But that still doesn't work. And so then God says, okay, I'm going to pick a specific person to try to have a good deal going with human beings. And he picks Abraham. And then we have that genealogy there and the tribes. And you know that eventually they go down to Egypt, they're redeemed, and they have the revelation at Sinai. That's sort of a mini version of the book of Genesis and Exodus. So the importance of the Exodus to Judaism. So this is our central story. The Exodus is our central story. It tells us that it is possible to get out of the narrow places that Egypt represents, because in Hebrew, Egypt is Mitzrayim, which means narrow places. We are able to get out of those narrow places. It is possible. And everything that we have in our history, in our memory, is really refracted through that lens. In the story, miracles are what delivers us. Again, whether we believe in that kind of miracle is another story. We talked about miracles being other kinds of things, but the point is that is how it is given to us here, which is that it's because of God. Yahweh is the name that scholars use for the Hebrew God. And this demonstrates that God works through history. Now, that is problematic. Why would that be problematic, that we say that God works through history? What do you think?
Because of the enormous suffering.
Because of the kind of suffering that we go through, because of, how about the Shoah, the Holocaust? How do we explain that God didn't intervene then? So again, a complicated theology, one to be addressed by various theologians. We will get to that when we get to that lesson on the Holocaust. We discussed a little bit whether or not the Exodus was a so-called true story. And here are some historical realities. I mentioned a little bit of this when we talked about Passover, but there really were migrations to Egypt. Who knows, by an Asiatic people. And there's this group called the Habiru that might have been the Hebrews. The Israelites supposedly sojourned in Egypt from 1700 BCE to 1300. And there is this Goshen settlement where the Hebrews were settled. And as I said earlier, even though we were talking about before we started the class that the haroset is supposed to represent the mortar that they used, the fact is the way the brick making is described in the book of Exodus is documented in Egyptian texts and art, even if mortar is not what was actually used. And I don't know that mortar is the correct translation, but the brick making really does resemble how bricks were made in Egypt. Now, the question is, were Hebrew slaves in Egypt at that time? Or did they just have certain knowledge because there was commerce and travel and all that? Can't answer that question. The 10 plagues reflect a real understanding of Egyptian religion. And as I said, there was this class called the Habiru, who were domestic servants and state slaves. Now, were those the Hebrews? Were those the Israelites? We're not sure. Could be. But as I mentioned last time, the dating is problematic. There's a stela of Merneptah, this pharaoh who went into Canaan around 1200 BCE. And so that is one thing that proves to us that there is a problem with the dating, because according to the Bible, it was the 15th century, and it really should have been the 13th century where they would have entered the land of Canaan. And then you have the Amarna letters from the 14th century BCE that tell us that Israel had not conquered Canaan before 1300 BCE. So that's at least one thing that we know is wrong, is the dating. Also, even though it says in Exodus that members of every single tribe went down to Egypt, that's not the case. In fact, Judah, which was the last tribe standing and which wrote the history, Judah was the last tribe to join the group. Okay, so now we get to Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up to the mountain and recounts to all the people the words of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, God, and all the regulations, and all the people answered in one voice and said, all the things that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh has spoken, we will do. Then Moses took the account of the covenant and read it in the ears of the people. They said, all that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh has spoken, we will do, and we will hearken. That's a kind of fudge a little bit on the translation. And again, it's very hard to understand some of these things if you don't know Hebrew, but in Hebrew, it's na'aseh v'nishma, which means we will do and we will hear. Of course, hearken is connected to the word to hear, or we will understand. Now, it reverses the order that you normally think about. Usually you think, I will listen, I will understand, and then I will do, rather than I will do and then I will listen, or I will understand. So of course, there's a lot of midrash on this. But, we also know that a lot of times, you might say, oh, this particular mitzvah doesn't make any sense to me. Why would I put on tefillin? Or why would I eat kosher or whatever? But you say, you know what, I'm going to do it and see, maybe it'll make sense to me after I start doing it. And sometimes it takes doing it in order to understand what it's all about. So the 5 books of Moses basically take us from the creation of the world, Noah and the flood, the patriarchs and matriarchs, the Exodus. Then we have the book of Leviticus, which is basically a book of the priests and what all of their rituals are all about, like how to do the sacrifices and how to dress and, all of that stuff. Then you have the book of Numbers, which in Hebrew is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And that's the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And then you have the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is basically, it means a second telling. And in Hebrew, it's called Devarim, which means words. And it's basically Moses's final speech as the Israelites are poised to enter the land of Canaan. So we start from a man who, when he's told at the burning bush to go liberate the Israelites who were slaves, Moses says, I can't do that because I have some sort of speech impairment. I can't speak. And by the end of the story, it's an entire book that is his speech to the Israelites, reviewing the history and giving them the laws and basically the constitution of the new place, the new land. But we end the Torah poised to enter the land. We never enter it. Not only does Moses he's not allowed to enter it, he's punished because of, it's not clear, but the most immediate story is that he's been hitting this rock in the desert to get water for people. And this last time God says, speak to the rock, and he doesn't speak to it. He hits it twice. Remember, he has an anger problem. Remember that? First time we see him as an adult, he kills somebody. So God says, because of this, you're not going to enter the land. But he also says, you rebels. So he's angry and fed up with these people. So maybe he's not the person to lead them into the land. And he also says, shall we, meaning him and Aaron, get water for you, meaning that what about what God is going to supposedly do for us? God's the one who's going to get the water, so he's not giving enough kavod or honor to God. It's not entirely clear why he's not allowed to go in, but none of us go in. First of all, the people who leave Egypt, the Israelites who leave Egypt, are not the ones who are going to enter the land. They worship the golden calf. They didn't believe that, God could help them conquer Canaan. And so they are punished by not being able to enter. Or you could say they still have a slave mentality, and in order to be free people with their own country and their own constitution, they need to have shed this slave mentality. Because by the way, the first thing they do when they leave Egypt is to complain the minute they leave. Oh, we had such good food back in Egypt, cucumbers and melons and flesh pots and onions, and now all we have is this manna. It's so boring. Okay, so before we go on to the next piece, anybody have any questions or comments or concerns?
Is Aaron the spokesperson prior to Moses finding his voice?
Yes.
Because that's a pattern of the talking chief, before
Oh.
there is actually a ruler.
Ah,
Is
okay,
that the
interesting.
chief doesn't say much, but the talking chief is the one who translates.
Interesting.
So it's also a transition from chieftainships to later on
Interesting.
a
Thank you.
kingdom.
It's also interesting that, we're not sure what his speech problem is. Some people think it's a stutter. And it's interesting when you think about someone like Joe Biden, who has a stutter, who, has overcome it amazingly. And Richard Levy, who was the rabbi, who was the head of the rabbinic program when I was in seminary, also had a stutter. Now, he was not always able to overcome it, but still in all, to become a rabbi when you have a stutter is a pretty big leap of faith, right? Because when you get nervous or stressed, that's probably when it comes out. But yeah, so Moses is somebody who stuttered, and yet somehow he was able to overcome it to the point where he's incredibly eloquent at the end of his life. Any other comments? Okay, so as I said, Joshua is the first book in the section of the Hebrew Bible, which is called Tanakh. The T stands for Torah, and the N for Nevi'im, which is prophets, and the K for Ketuvim, which is writings. So this section is Joshua, Judges, the 2 books of Samuel, the 2 books of Kings, and then you have what we think of as prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then you have the 12 what are called minor prophets, and they're not minor because they're not important. They're minor because their books are short. And so you have like Amos and Hosea and Habakkuk, so those 12. And those prophets in the Christian Bible are at the end rather than in the middle. Okay, so Joshua is a kind of, I'm going to put in quotes, idealized version of the conquest. The idealized version is that Joshua, who is anointed, as you can see here, by Moses, is able to go in there and in 3 lightning campaigns is able to take over Canaan, supposedly. So they come in, they get the territory. And as you see here, this is how the land was divided up according to the different tribes. Judah being pretty much the biggest one. Eventually, the northern tribes, so that's any tribe north of Judah, will split off and create a separate kingdom. We'll talk about that in a moment. And you see that all the way to the west, you have the Philistines, right? The Philistines are a constant source of concern for the Israelites because they're more sophisticated in terms of their weaponry and all that. And then you see some of the other enemies like Amalek, way to the bottom on the left, Edom, Moab, Ammon. These are tribes and groups that attacked the Israelites a lot and are sworn enemies. So this is the, as I said, idealized version. They came in, they conquered. Now, if you read the book of Joshua, it's very disturbing because there really is genocide in there. And I've really, we just studied it in our Torah study, which is now called Tanakh study, because unfortunately, it's there in black and white. Kill off all the Canaanites, destroy their cities, occasionally take booty depending on what the particular situation is. Sometimes you destroy everything, sometimes you take booty, and it's really disturbing. And so I remind people that there are 3 strategies to use. One is to say it is a problematic text. The second is to historicize it. This was written a long time ago, and this was considered to be the correct thing to do. Not to say that there aren't still people who believe in similar kinds of conquests. And then third of all, you try to think of it not literally, that, we need to conquer the idolatry within ourselves rather than actual human beings. So there were tribal elements that had not been in Egypt but recognize their connection to the tribes led by Joshua. So there were some people who probably left in Canaan who didn't go to Egypt for, during the famine. Canaanites more identified with Israelite culture and religion. And then the tribes that had entered with Joshua. And as I said, the first book of the Deuteronomic history is the story of Israel from the conquest of Canaan to the Babylonian exile, which the Deuteronomic history is everything from the book of Joshua all the way through to the end of the book of Kings, and then some passages in the prophets later on. 3 lightning swift campaigns to conquer Canaan, destroying the enemies. And it's framed by these 2 speeches. The first by God commanding the conquest of the land, and the second by Joshua, warning of the need for faithful observance of the law. So Joshua conquered the land because God told him to. And God said, I'm going to be with you, and this is what you need to do. And Joshua keeps telling people you need to follow God's law, and if not, you're going to be punished. And that is the whole Deuteronomic history, which is that the Israelites have somebody ruling them, like a judge or something, and they're okay for a certain number of years, and then they go off to worship Baal or some other god, and they get punished by some other enemy coming in to conquer them. And the book of Judges is a more realistic portrayal of how the Israelites came in. First of all, when they left Egypt, as they went through the desert, they gathered people along the way. So let's start with the fact that we're not talking about any sort of pure people at all, genetically or any other way. It says that they picked up an Erev Rav, a mixed multitude of people. And when they came to Canaan, there were Canaanites who joined their cause. So it's not like, oh, let's kill off all the Canaanites. They killed some people, some kings, but there were places that were still standing and people that were still standing that supposedly were killed in the book of Joshua. So more realistically, there were some conquests, there were some ways in which Canaanites joined the Israelites. And the book of Judges is about how all these tribes were in a very loose confederacy. So it was not a kingdom or anything like that, it was a confederacy, each one run by a judge who was also a general, sometimes a prophet, basically a ruler. And they would sometimes get together, to fight off the Philistines or to fight off one of the other enemies. The book of Judges is written in such a way that it ends with this constant refrain: everyone did what was right in their own eyes, for there was no king in Israel. That's a prohibition. You're not supposed to have a king in Israel. Anybody have any ideas why? Who is the king? The real king. Yeah, Christine. Were you pointing up to the heaven? Yeah, God is the king. How can you have an earthly king, right? In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, the description of a king is that he's supposed to spend his time writing out a Torah and studying the Torah. And he's very, very limited in what he's allowed to do. He's not supposed to get horses and wives and all that stuff. And also, the other thing, aside from the fact that you don't want to have a king who's going to challenge the guy upstairs, I'm saying this metaphorically, you don't want to have somebody like that. But at the same time, there's a clear fear that the person in power is going to be corrupt or corrupted. And we know about that, right? Power corrupts. Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, right? So do you want that kind of person leading you? However, because of the Philistines and the constant threats that they were getting, the Israelites actually asked their prophet Samuel for a king. Anyone know who the first king of Israel was? Kind of a trick question. No?
Saul.
Yeah, Saul. Who said that? Oh, Nathan. Good. Okay. So yes, King Saul. King Saul was the first king. Okay, so we're going to go on with our story. As I said, the book of Judges is a different kind of conquest. And as I said, there's a cyclical pattern showing the need for the various judges. Constantly, the Israelite people get involved in apostasy. They get punished. They cry out to God. God rescues them. God sends them a number of different judges. So, and in the beginning, you have judges who are people who would normally not be at the head of the society. Ehud is a left-handed guy. Devorah is a woman. Gideon is the son of a prostitute. So you get these people who are not people who would normally be in charge, but at the very beginning of this society where things haven't been worked out yet, they are there. Now, Devorah, by the way, is a very strong woman who is a prophetess, a judge, a poet, and she leads her army, even though Barak is the general, but he's afraid to go unless she's there with him. So she's a great big heroine. Saul is the first king of Israel, and those are his years. He's anointed by the prophet Samuel. He commits suicide during a battle. That is a big, fat no-no. Suicide is considered a really bad thing in Jewish tradition and law. Now, the way people get around this, because you're not supposed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery if you've committed suicide. However, if you are not of a right mind when you commit suicide, then that is considered different. So of course, if you want your loved one to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, you have somebody to declare that the person was not of right mind. Now, the story about David is that, okay, Saul becomes the king. He is a reluctant king. He doesn't really necessarily want to become the king, but he's sort of dragged into it. And he is, we think maybe he was bipolar because he really went into these funks. And he actually gets cheered up by David, who plays the lyre for him. Now, David is the youngest son. I think there are 8 sons, and he's the youngest one. And he is a very popular, very good-looking, very sexual person. And Saul is very, very jealous of him. He's constantly trying to kill him. They'll sit together and all of a sudden he'll throw a spear at him. And at one point he sends his men to go find him and to kill him. Well, meantime, David has married Michal, who is one of Saul's daughters. And she actually lies to his henchman and says that he's gone. What she's actually done is she's put some stuff in the bed and made it look like he's still sleeping, and then lets him out the window, which of course takes a lot of strength. But Saul had originally offered to let him marry Merav, who was another daughter of his, if he would kill a certain number of Philistines. But by killing, he says he wants their foreskins. And of course, David does more, 10 times more than Saul asked him for, brings him even more foreskins, but he does not let him marry Merav. Eventually, as I said, he marries Michal. And you can tell right away that David is ambitious because he overhears some people saying, oh, the king is going to give his daughter to whoever can do this or that. Ah, really? And remember, the first thing David does is kill Goliath, the giant. And the reward for killing the giant Goliath was going to be to marry Merav. But then, as I said, he ends up reneging on that deal. So David is a very strong, he's a warrior. All the women love him. And Saul is constantly jealous. So the reason Saul actually, by the way, is not allowed to be part of a dynasty is because he's told to kill Amalek. Amalek being one of those enemies. I showed you where they were down at the bottom left of the screen. And he doesn't kill the king, whose name is Agag. And he saves some booty for the soldiers. And he was told to completely destroy Amalek, the people, their booty, their king. And instead of doing that, he lets the king live. And Samuel, who is the prophet, is very upset about that because he did not obey God. And so he's told, guess what? You are not going to be the head of a dynasty. That's why Saul is not too happy about David, because he senses that David is going to be the next guy. So David does become the king. He is a warrior, as I said. He's a writer of Psalms. The Psalms that we have in the Ketuvim, in the writings, are attributed to him. He rules for about 40 years, and those are the dates there. He unites the people of Israel. He leads them into battle and is victorious. He conquers a land. He is not allowed to build the temple, by the way, because he has blood on his hands. But he is able to unite the country. He creates Jerusalem, which was not conquered up to this point, as the capital of the country, both in terms of civil administration and in terms of religious. It's a religious center. So what happens? He ascends to the throne by being very savvy politically. As I said, once he discovers that, oh, gee, the king's going to give his daughter in marriage to whoever kills Goliath or whoever kills the Philistines, whatever the offering was, he's thinking, this is my path to becoming part of the royal family. And, as I said, he unites the country, he does all these really good things. The problem is he's not so great when it comes to interpersonal relations. So he marries Michal in order to be part of the royal family. He basically forgets about her after that. He has other wives. And then this is a pattern for tragedy. So everything's going, ascending to a beautiful point of victory and success. And just at that point, he messes up badly. So what happens is there's a battle going on and he should be in the battle. He shouldn't be back in Jerusalem, but he is back in Jerusalem. And he's sitting around and he looks out his window and he sees this beautiful woman taking a bath. Now, if she's taking a bath, it's probably a ritual bath, which probably means it's when she's done with her period, which means that this is the most fertile time of her cycle. He decides he wants her. And so he brings her over and sleeps with her. She subsequently tells him that she's pregnant. Well, she happens to be married, so he commits adultery, right? He's messing with somebody else's wife or woman. What is he going to do about it? Well, Uriah, who is her husband, is off in battle. He calls him back and he says to him, hey, you know what? You've had a hard time. Go spend the night with your wife. And Uriah says, no, I'm not going to spend the night with my wife, because you're not supposed to engage in sexual activity when you're in battle. Of course, David wants him to sleep with his wife so that it'll look like the husband got her pregnant, not him. So the next day he gives him lots of wine. And he says, hey, go sleep with your wife. No, I'm not going to do that. All right, so what's David going to do? He writes a letter to his general, Joab, and he says, put this guy in the front lines in the next battle. So he gives a letter to Uriah. Uriah takes it to Joab, not even realizing what's in there, and he gets killed. So now what's happened? King David has committed adultery and murder. He committed adultery with a woman named Bathsheba, and she's pregnant, but guess what? The baby dies as punishment. And, he does do some repenting. And by the way, at this point, the prophet who is around is named Nathan. And in order to tell David that he's committed a grievous sin, he tells him a story about a guy with a little lamb and how it's the only lamb he has, and somebody comes along and who already has a whole, herd of sheep, who decides to grab this lamb, and David says, that's terrible. This guy should be put to death. And Nathan says to him, that man is you. Speaking truth to power. That is what prophets do. So David repents and all of that, but the baby still dies. Now, he has a bunch of kids, of course. He's had many wives. And Solomon is, of course, not the oldest son. So, of course, he's going to become the next king. So let's go on to Solomon. So Solomon is a wise king, right? You probably all know the story about the baby. And I think this is the illustration right here. There are two women who come to King Solomon, both claiming that this baby is theirs. One of them is the real mother. The other one is someone who somehow rolled over and killed her own kid when she was sleeping. And so King Solomon says, all right, let's be fair. Let's cut the baby in two. And he knows better than thinking that that's actually what's going to happen. He knows very well that the real mother is going to say, give her the baby. That's how he determines who the real mother is. So he's very wise, very wealthy. His reign is from 970 to 931 BCE. And there is going to be this dynasty of King David. He builds the first temple in Jerusalem. But his sins include idolatry. Now, idolatry because he marries all these foreign wives. And they're going to bring all of their foreign gods into the marriage. And so it's going to be very hard for him to be completely loyal to our God. Now, the other thing he does, he does a lot of building, especially the first temple. So what does he need for that? He needs money and he needs people to work. So he institutes a corvée, which is a requirement to work a certain amount of time every year on the part of the citizens, and he imposes taxes. Well, guess what? That is not something that is very popular. So when he dies, his son Rehoboam takes over, and people come to him and say, hey, you know what? We cannot continue with this burden of corvée and taxes. You need to do something to relieve us of this. And Rehoboam goes to his advisors. And what do you think they say? Okay. Anybody have a thought about what the advisors say? Yeah, Christine.
Well, if they are anything like the advisors that Trump had, they'd say, go ahead and, keep it in place. You're the man.
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, but make it worse.
Oh, yeah.
Impose more
Double
taxes
down.
and more corvée. That always works well, right? Like imposing more work on these slaves in Egypt certainly, worked really well to get them to, not be disloyal. So Jeroboam is one of the people in this delegation who goes and says, please, put a cap on the taxes. And Jeroboam and his pals decide, you know what? We are going to break off. And so the 10 northern tribes withdraw their allegiance to the house of David, and Jeroboam becomes the king of Samaria, which is in the north. You've heard of Judea and Samaria. Well, here we are. Judea is the southern kingdom, Samaria is the northern kingdom. And this is why there are people in Israel who don't want to give up the West Bank, because that's where these places were. Jeroboam fortifies Shechem as the capital and builds 2 temples with, guess what, golden calves. Now, there are people, or at least one, I'm sure there was more than one, who actually believe that there wasn't an exodus at all from Egypt, that really what it is a story of the break off of the Northern Kingdom, because there are the golden calves up there, which represent, that idolatry that the Israelites supposedly were engaged in when they left Egypt. And that really the story of the Exodus is just a story that was more contemporary, that was sort of retrojected into another time period. The way, Shakespeare will take a story about England and put it in Denmark or something to avoid censorship. So now you have these two countries. So during the first temple period, we have kings and prophets. The history is Joshua all the way to the exile in Babylonia, but the first temple period begins with King Solomon and the prophets, because all these prophets live during the period of these various kings. And I sent you an outline of the history of early Israel with the time frame as well as which books of the Bible this is recounted in. Because the prophets have an official position, and one of their roles is to speak truth to power. So the Northern Kingdom. Okay, now since the Southern Kingdom, Judah, is the one that is writing the history, because they're the last people standing, they are going to portray the northern rulers as bad. So Ahab is considered a really horrible king. Interestingly enough, this dynasty where Omri was the father of Ahab and followed by Ahab, their dynasty lasts quite a long time, which is interesting because they are actually very successful politically and economically, these guys, even though they're considered, people involved in apostasy and all of that. But they have a long period of time that's economically and politically very viable. And politically, because, that's the thing that happened with King Solomon. He married women from different peoples, which means that he was setting up alliances with those people. And the same thing with this guy. But he marries this woman, Jezebel, and she is from a different people, from Phoenicia, and she has different gods. And he is, of course, swayed to bring some of these into the Israelite religion and the Israelite polity. He also does something really horrible with regard to somebody who really, didn't deserve to be killed, which is that he wants somebody's vineyard. And his wife says, well, you want it? You're the king, take it. So you kill the guy and take his vineyard. Now, Jezebel, to tell you the truth, she's treated so horribly in the Bible. The fact is, she's not necessarily terrible. She just belongs to a different religion. Of course, she does kill off a bunch of prophets from our religion, but, we've done the same thing to them. So, but her ending is horrid. She eventually, ends up on the street eaten by dogs. It's really horrible. Okay, we're not going to do Hezekiah just yet because I think we'll take a break. It's 1:59, so let's come back at 2:10. Unless anybody has a question before we break off. Anybody? Okay, so let's just take a break and see you back in 10 minutes. All right. Okay, so we're going to continue with, so as I said, the history was written by the South, by Judah. So their kings are going to come across as much more pious and wonderful than the kings of the North. As I said, Ahab, who is the son of Omri and a dynasty that was actually quite successful, is trashed. But then we have all these wonderful pious kings who were good, but weren't necessarily so great at politics and, war. So Hezekiah, 715 to 686, and the country was not really independent at this point because the Assyrians are basically in control. In 722, they conquered the kingdom of Israel in the north and deport most of its inhabitants. And that's where you get the idea of the 10 lost tribes. The tribes just disappear. Now, there are people who have claimed that they were part of the 10 lost tribes. Who knows at this point? It's just too far away. But that's what happens to the north. The south, remains under Assyrian sovereignty, really. But Hezekiah is acknowledged and lauded for reforming the cult and the temple, where he, gets rid of all these different places of worship because it's all supposed to be centralized in the temple in Jerusalem. He eradicates idolatry throughout the country, and he does something very important. And this is something you can actually visit when you go to Jerusalem. Some of you may have done this. He ensures the water supply of Jerusalem by creating a tunnel to the pool of water of Siloam. So you can actually walk along when you go. Okay, so when you go to the Western Wall, there's a part where you go inside and then you eventually go through this waterway that he created. So it still exists. But he is defeated by, the Assyrians and is not able to really stay very independent. The other king who is lauded, those are the two idolized kings aside from David. So Hezekiah and Josiah. Josiah is 640 to 609. And he does this incredible reform. He orders his high priest to renovate the temple. And while this high priest is cleaning out the treasure room, he discovers a book. And it's called the Book of the Law. And it's the book of Deuteronomy, supposedly. Okay. Now, is this a real book of God or is it not? They go to a prophetess named Huldah. And Huldah authenticates this book. And it says that you're supposed to exclusively worship Yahweh, and you are not supposed to have local sanctuaries. You're supposed to have a temple, a centralized temple. And he reads the book. He goes into mourning. He puts on sackcloth and ashes, and decides to reform the cult so that the high places and the local sanctuaries are destroyed, and everything is going to revolve around the temple. Now, Huldah, you may never have heard of her. And the rabbis say, it was really her husband. No, it was her. And my Bible professor, Rabbi Dr. Tamar Eskenazi, somebody made her a t-shirt that said, "Remember Huldah." So we must remember Huldah. She's one of those women, when you talk about how to, kind of bring feminism into this Jewish tradition, one of the things is to find the Huldahs that are hidden in there, right? You would never know that there was a Huldah if you read quickly or if you were told the story by other people, but she's in there. So that's one way of doing it. Other ways are midrash and archaeological finds where you find out, oh, you mean there were women who were presidents of synagogues way back when. What a thought. Okay, so the story is not the one that we, tend to be sold on. So you got to look for those stories out there. So, as I said, the prophets are there to remind the kings and the people that they have a commitment to justice. So the prophet Amos, let justice roll on like waters, righteousness like a mighty stream. That's one of his most famous verses. Micha, what does God require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Isaiah, this is what we read at Yom Kippur. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? In other words, don't give me your fasting and your religious ceremonies that don't mean anything. This is the kind of fasting I've chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? And Isaiah 2, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, apparently this idea of beating your swords into plowshares is not a metaphor. This is what people actually did. They only had so much metal to go around. And so when they were just being agricultural, they would turn them into plowshares. When there was a need to fight a war, they would turn it into swords. Of course, now it's become a metaphor because we don't know anything about agriculture anymore or sword fighting. Okay. Now you get the end of the Southern Kingdom as well, which is Babylonia. See, all of these different empires are in charge. So, first you had Assyria, which, took over the Northern Kingdom. Now you have Babylonia, which is going to take over the Southern Kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem in 597 BCE. Well, here it says BC, but it should be BCE. Captured the city, and King Joachim, along with all of the aristocracy of Jerusalem. He looted the treasures of the temple. He exiled 10,000 officers, the craftsmen, and 7,000 soldiers. He appoints Zedekiah as king of Judah. Now, Zedekiah is from the line of King David, but he rebelled. That was a big mistake. And he was captured with his sons. And he's brought in chains to Babylonia, where his children were executed in front of him. And then in 586 BCE, Solomon's temple was burned down and the walls of Jerusalem destroyed. And the rest of the Jews are exiled to Babylonia, and Gedaliah is appointed as the administrator of the Jews. Now, so in 597, you sort of get the elite that is exiled. In 586, you get the rest of the people, but the fact of the matter is not everybody left, which is very interesting and important when we go a little bit further in the history. But actually what happens in Babylonia is that actually the Jews do okay. They actually do okay. They're given a certain amount of autonomy. And we'll see that actually when they're allowed to go back to Canaan, to Judea, some of them don't go. But talking about the exile, here is a psalm, which you may very well know. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the eternal on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. I just think of Jimmy Cliff when I see this song. I mean, obviously these kinds of songs or the story of the Exodus have been very instrumental in encouraging various kinds of rebellions and revolutions. So here you have the beginning of the diaspora. You have the Jews being sent off to Babylonia. Persia is, the area where originally Abraham came from and his family. Egypt, people go to Egypt, they eventually go to Rome. So you have this big dispersion of Jews all over the place. And then this is a little parenthesis, because you also see that you have Jews from different kind of traditions. You've got the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the Jews who go to Eastern Europe, Germany and Eastern Europe, France to some extent, all these countries here, Russia. The Sephardic Jews are the Jews who started off in Spain, and they go to Northern Africa. They also go to the Americas. And some of them also go to places like Holland. For example, Spinoza ended up in Holland. I mean, his family ended up in Holland. Then you have, and that's the Sephardi. The Sephardi are those who started off in Spain, because That comes from the word in Hebrew for Spain. And then you have the Mizrahi. Mizrahi means from the east. So you have all these Jews that were in different countries in these countries, Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc. And you have Jews who ended up in all those countries. They have eventually, most of them came back to Israel, because in 1948, when Israel was finally, created as a third, independent country, the Arab countries either kicked them out or persecuted them. So they ended up leaving. And you have very few Jews left in those countries. Yes, Christine.
Did the Sephardim come from the Roman diaspora to Rome and then to Spain that was a province of Rome?
I don't know the answer to that. I know they came from Spain. I don't know if they originally came from Rome. I don't know.
I was just wondering if it came up through North Africa or over from Rome or both.
I don't know, but I will look it up.
Thank you.
Nate, did you have your hand up?
I was just gonna have a tidbit about some Jews in Tajikistan, but
Go ahead.
Don't
Yeah,
wanna waste
no,
time.
Nate has done a lot of traveling in the stands and knows quite a bit about them. So go ahead.
so there was a small group, roughly 50, if I remember correctly, of Jews in Tajikistan in the capital, Dushanbe, and they had a historic synagogue is 100 years old or whatever, and the president decided he wanted to put a palace right where the synagogue happened to be. There was a huge global uproar. They eventually decided, oh no, we're not going to do that. We're going to let the Jews stay where they are. We're going to keep the synagogue. We're going to move the palace somewhere else. And 5 years later, they just did it anyway without announcing it. And then just like that, the entire Jewish population of Tajikistan no longer had a home, and they went to Israel. And now Tajikistan has, unless I visit, no Jews.
Is that the one where everything's white in that country?
That's Turkmenistan, which,
Oh.
as far as, the records are kind of hard to come by, but as far as the records show, there are no Jews there either.
Very
There's
sad. Very sad.
still a small population of Jews in Uzbekistan, the Bukharan Jews, but most of them went to Israel as well.
Thank you. And Stephen says one of his friends is a Sephardic Jew. Where is he from? Do you know?
Spain. Has
Spain?
ancestors that originate from Spain.
Yeah. Well, actually, Spain has started to, starting a few years ago, to say that any Jews that could prove that they were originally from Spain, their families were originally from Spain, that they could become citizens. Yeah.
One of the things that is interesting about the Sephardim, my sister-in-law's family are Sephardic, and a lot of Sephardim have Spanish names, right? But instead of ending the names with a Z, usually it's with an S.
Huh.
That's a marker for Sephardim.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So we're going to go back to our ancient history. That was a little detour to show how Jews left and went to various places. So after we had Assyria and Babylonia, now we have Persia as the empire that is taking over the area. And Cyrus the Great is the Persian king. And in 539 BCE, he takes over, gets control of Mesopotamia, and he ends the Babylonian captivity. In 538 BCE, he decrees that the temple should be rebuilt and that Jews can return to their land. And in 516, under someone named Zerubbabel, the temple is rebuilt. He's the governor, not the king, but the temple is rebuilt. It's a sort of shadow of what it used to be, because it was a big, magnificent temple. And now, they don't have the kind of money that they had once upon a time, but they do rebuild it. And we will see a couple of people who come in during this period. But first, Alexander the Great is the next big empire, right? The Greek Empire takes over. And they put together a giant empire. And as I mentioned during the session on Hanukkah, the Greek culture and Hellenism become the prevailing culture. So he takes over Persia and Egypt and Judah and Samaria, and it is the Hellenistic period for Greek culture. And then, as we discussed last week, we don't have to go into too many details, the Maccabees, and that is also the same family as the Hasmoneans, they are able to take back the country. Because after Alexander's death, you have the Syrian-based Seleucids who rule Judea, and Antiochus IV prohibits the practice of Judaism. As I mentioned last time, it's really because there was a civil war going on. It's not that he had any problem with Judaism per se, but as we mentioned, the temple is desecrated, and the Jews finally revolt in 166 BCE, and they enter the temple and purify it, celebrate Hanukkah, and they, for about 100 years, we have a certain amount of independence. Unfortunately, first you have Simon Maccabeus. Now you see already that he's changed his name, so it sounds Greek. He takes over. They're independent for a while, but the problem is they take on both the priestly high priest and the ruler positions. They were supposed to be hereditary positions, and none of these Hasmoneans are from the line of Aaron, and they're not from the line of David. And eventually, as we said, power corrupts, and they get involved in bloodshed, and they take on the Hellenistic culture themselves. And what eventually happens is two brothers claim the kinship. And they make a huge mistake because now you have Rome as being the empire out there. They call on Rome to arbitrate. And so Rome says, no problem, happy to come in and help you set this up. You see at the top, it's 230 to 140 BCE. Rome, it comes into the Mediterranean, the East Mediterranean. We have 100 years of Jewish autonomy under the Hasmoneans. And Pompey comes in and annexes the land of Israel in 63 BCE. And we're going to talk about Herod the Great in a moment, who rules from 37 to 4. And in 20, Herod creates the Temple Mount, which we're going to talk about as well. Now, unfortunately, the Roman rulers are not the greatest. Herod rules from 37 to 4. So, you have the two brothers who are, kind of fighting with each other. They call in Rome, and you've got a bunch of people ruling sort of from Rome. Now, Herod is theoretically Jewish, but he was one of those people that the Hasmoneans, his father was converted by the Hasmoneans. So somehow there's always a legitimacy issue here about Herod. Is he really Jewish? And he's not a descendant of the Hasmoneans, and he's not a descendant of King David. So is he really okay to be ruling this land? He was incredibly paranoid. So he ruled by terror and brutality. He was a tyrant, a madman, a murderer, a builder of great cities and fortresses. So he built Masada. Masada is the fortress that will be the last holdout for the people rebelling against Rome, which we'll get to, and Caesarea. If you've ever been to Israel, you can still go to the ruins there. You can go to Masada. You can also go to the ruins of Caesarea. He, hired and fired high priests outside of the priestly establishment, a big no-no. Now, at one point, he married a Hasmonean woman because that was a way to try to be legitimate. But he murdered her, and he murdered other wives and his children and his relations because he was paranoid. Okay? And as a matter of fact, he said that when he died, that all the young men should be killed because he was worried that they would celebrate his death. So that's how paranoid he was. And the fortresses that he built were also out of paranoia. But he did rebuild the temple. And it was both a way to win the support of the Jews and to have a capital that was worthy of his grandeur, at least in his own mind. And of course, he also built pagan cities. Now, in order to build this temple, now the temple was already built, right? This is not a third temple. It's an expansion of the temple that already existed that was rebuilt in the 6th century BCE. So what he did was he expanded the platform that the temple would stand on. So the western wall that you all know about is actually a retaining wall. It is not a wall of the temple. It's a retaining wall where he expanded that platform, and he made the temple much more elaborate, much fancier. Now, why did a revolt begin against the
Oh, never mind.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a question or
No, I was wondering if it was the same Herod that was educated in Rome, and the next slide answers that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So he was he was a Roman sort of proxy. He wasn't really he was a king of the Jews, but he wasn't really representing the Jewish interests as much. So Herod, once again, lavish spending, right? So the money went to his building programs as opposed to his people. And then you got other people following him. You have the Emperor Caligula. I'm sure you already have heard of Caligula. He wasn't a great guy. And he tried to withdraw the rights and the privileges of the Jews. And he ordered a statue of himself to be erected in the temple. He died before that happened, but that didn't make him very popular. After him, you had various procurators sent by Rome who were often incompetent, corrupt, and wicked. So you had rulers who were problematic, number one. And then you had economic conditions that were really tough because after building all these programs, well, guess what happened to the people who were building all of these fortresses in the temple? You had 18,000 unemployed laborers. And the city of Jerusalem became a kind of welfare state because people didn't have jobs or incomes. And then, of course, you had tension between the upper and the lower classes, the city dwellers and the country folk. That's what happened under the Hasmoneans as well. I mean, before the Hasmoneans. Big landowners were allied with the Romans. What a surprise. And other rich Jews befriended the Romans as well. So the revolt against the Romans was also a revolt against the aristocratic Jews. That is exactly what happened before Judah Maccabee and his family came along. You had the elite in cahoots with the Hellenistic culture and with the Greek rulers. It worked well for them. It didn't work for the population. So now you have a revolt against Rome. What happens? Oh, and twice you had Romans trying to bring a bust of the emperor into Jerusalem. The temple was corrupt, and apocalypticism was in the air. The feeling was that any day now the Messiah would come, which is why this coincides with Jesus being around, right? The idea that Jesus was the Messiah, according to certain people. You also had the Dead Sea sect that went out to the desert because things were so corrupt in the, in the temple, etc., under the Hasmoneans as well as under the Romans. You had the sense that a big war between the good and the bad was going to come along, and somehow the good would be redeemed. So the Great Revolt occurred between 66 and 73 CE. And it's a turning point for Judaism. We'll see why. Vespasian is named the emperor, and General Titus leads the campaign and the siege against Jerusalem. And in 70 CE, the temple is destroyed. Now, the holdouts were a group of particularly fervent revolutionaries, and they went to Masada, and they held out for quite a while, but eventually they commit mass suicide in 73 CE. And the failure of the revolt is attributed to a great extent to the division among the rebels. The Talmud says it's because of sinat chinam, which means free-flowing hatred. So you had people called the Sicarii, and they were called Sicarii because they carried around a dagger that is in Latin, Sicarus or something, right? So they were called the Sicarii. They would walk around with daggers, not to kill Romans, but to kill Jews that they didn't think were, fervent enough rebels. And you had people who were keeping everybody inside the city of Jerusalem. They wouldn't let them out. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Out of this disaster will come a whole new understanding of Judaism. But here you see, this is the Arch of Titus. And you see the Romans carrying away all the really significant implements of the temple. So that's what's above the arch, and this is a detail here. And here you see people at the Western Wall. And again, the Western Wall is a wall just to keep back the earth. It's not a wall of the temple, but this is where, people consider to be a very, very holy spot. You do notice here that it's all men because it's divided between men and women, and the women have a much smaller area. And they're not allowed to have a Torah there, and a number of other things. And here are people praying at the Kotel. And by the way, people, you see all these little white things along here? These are little notes, prayers that people put inside the cracks. They're filled and filled and filled with all these prayers. And this is a view of Jerusalem where you can see the whole wall that goes all the way around. But you notice that on the Temple Mount right now, this is the Temple Mount, this whole area. You notice that there are two very important mosques up there, which means that we can't build another temple up there, even if we wanted to. And I'm not sure that we want to, right? But this was taken over, later on by, the Arab conquerors. So we cannot actually lay claim to this at this point. Up until the War of 1967, we were not able to get even near the wall. But after 67, when we took over East Jerusalem, we finally were able to, get to the wall. And there's been excavations, but, it's very difficult in some places to excavate because you got Arab villages around here, and you can't just go in there and plow them down so that you can see what's underneath. But you can go, as I said, you can go inside and see a part of the wall that's not exposed. And if you don't have claustrophobia, that's a great thing to do. If you do have claustrophobia, which I do, don't go in there. I literally was so freaked out when I was in there because there were so many people and you're only going one person at a time and you can't get out of there. You just have to follow all these people for a while. So don't go in if you have claustrophobia. All right. This is a piece of the Talmud, which we will talk about. So this is actually the Dead Sea over here. And here's Masada up on a hill. And this is the place where people were living, the rebels were living, and they held off on the Romans, breaching the walls for several months, but eventually the Romans broke through. So that's something. Yes, Sasha.
I just want to say I've been there, and it's so amazing because they have an underground cistern of water, and I didn't realize that the water runs down from Hebron. It's slightly lower than Hebron, and so the water You know, when you think of like Roman history, you think of their cisterns and their incredible water canals, you know, and that you can see that going from Hebron down to Masada. And it's just a fascinating, just the engineering of how it was built is just phenomenal.
Yeah, great. I actually never saw that when I was there. Huh, I've been there a few times. Actually, what's interesting about visiting Israel is that every time you go, there are new discoveries. So even if you've been to Masada, the next time you go, it won't look the same. So I want to share something with you, which is, I mentioned that when Cyrus allowed the Jews to come back from Babylonia. So Ezra was a priest and a scribe who was exiled in Babylonia. And he returns Artaxerxes is Cyrus in 458 BCE. And this is under, you know, the Persians. He implements cultic and moral reforms. He tells the Israelites who were in the land of Judea that if they've married non-Jews or non-Israelites, they need to get divorced. Luckily, it never says they actually get divorced. So, but you know, this is one of those texts where it's very Jewish centric, shall we say. He is responsible for bringing the Torah to the land of Israel and making it the central authoritative text for the Jewish community. Now, his story and the story of Nehemiah are actually in what's called Ketuvim, in the writings. So it's not in chronological order. I'll mention Nehemiah and then I'll get back to Ezra. So Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king in Persia. He comes in, he rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem. He becomes the governor of Judah. And he, you know, if he thinks that people aren't behaving the way they're supposed to, he believes in beating them up and pulling their hair and doing things like that. Whereas Ezra is much gentler about trying to get people to reform themselves. So Ezra brings the Torah to Israel. Now, what does that exactly mean? I mean, theoretically, Moses wrote the Torah at God's dictation. But if you think about it from a scholarly point of view, the thinking is that Ezra actually was the editor of the Torah. Maybe, maybe not. He may have been. So in other words, somehow he had all of these strands of writing and memories that he put together. He brings it to the people, he reads it, and interprets it for the people. This is the key of Judaism, that, as I've said many times, it's an interpretive tradition. So before you even just have the plain old Torah and reading it, you have to also have someone who's going to explain it to you and interpret it. And this is what he does here. Okay. So when the temple is destroyed, this is when Judaism really starts, because Judaism is really not the religion of the Bible. The religion of the Bible is you have a temple, you bring sacrifices, right? The priests run the temple, and that's the Israelite religious cult. Judaism is based on text. So the minute Ezra brings the Torah to the people, that's the beginning of Judaism right there. Because he's reading it to them, he's interpreting it to them. That's way before the temple is even destroyed. And probably there were some synagogues early on, like in the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE, places of gathering. The synagogue is a place of gathering, it's a place of prayer, it's a place of study. So there were some synagogues that already existed. But once a temple is destroyed, I mean, this is a completely traumatic experience for the Jews. The temple is supposed to be the place where God is dwelling. We've destroyed God's house. How do we proceed? And we're in a kind of similar moment right now, actually, because with the pandemic and with changes in how people understand and view religion, in this country at this point. The way we practice Judaism and Christianity, for that matter, is no longer the way a lot of people are interested in practicing the religion. Yeah, us older people, yes, we're going to practice the religion the way we always, have. But younger people, that's not how they're going to do it. So how are we going to change the, basis for the religion? This is what happened in 70. So you had, the Babylonian exile kind of began this process because you had a cult that was based on the land of Israel, on the Davidic dynasty, and on the temple. All of these get destroyed. There's no Davidic dynasty anymore. There's no land of Israel when you're exiled to Babylonia. There's no temple. So certain things get emphasized in Babylonia. The Sabbath. If you look at if in fact the Torah was edited in Babylonia, the first holy thing is a Sabbath. So the Sabbath is something you can carry everywhere with you. You don't need to be in the land of Israel to observe the Sabbath. Same thing with various holidays. Same thing with the kosher laws. So you have various things that are portable. And the most important thing that's portable is the Torah. You can take the Torah anywhere you want. So you have the seeds for a transformation right there. But after the temple is destroyed in the year 70, it's not even like you could say, let's hope to rebuild it. No, you're done. And now you have a whole new religion, a whole new paradigm based on the written word, based on certain holidays, based on certain traditions. And the priestly class is gone too. What are you going to do with them? They no longer have a job. There's no temple. And so you have the rabbis, who are people who are going to interpret the written word for you. So here is this beautiful story that's in the Talmud about how Judaism was saved. So you're in Jerusalem and there's this revolt against the Romans going on. The Romans are cruel and awful, but Jews within the city of Jerusalem are not really getting along so well either, because you've got these really, radical revolutionaries that want everyone to hold fast, not to make any compromises with the Romans. They even destroyed the stores of grain that were there somehow to make people, more angry at the Romans. And there is a rabbi named Yohanan ben Zakkai who's trying to figure out what to do. What do we do? This is crazy. We're going to all be dead by the end of this. How are we going to survive? And he decides he's got to get out of the city and go talk to the Romans. But how is he going to do that? You're not allowed to go out. There are Jewish guards at the gates of the city who will not let you leave. So he talks to I think it's his cousin or something, who's one of the Sicarii, and he says, listen, I got to do this. So they come up with a plot, and the plot is Yohanan ben Zakkai will pretend that he's dead. They'll put him in a coffin. He'll get all sorts of smelly rags to put in the coffin with him so that it smells like he's dead. And his students are going to carry him out of the city in the coffin. So they get to the gates, and the people at the gates say, well, who is this? Well, it's our teacher, Yohanan ben Zakkai. Well, let me see if that's really true. And one of the guards is going to take a sword and stick it right through the casket to see if it really is a dead person in there. And they say, well, how can you do that to our teacher? And so they say, okay, go. So he gets out of the city and he goes and meets with Vespasian. At that time, Vespasian was a general who was laying siege to Jerusalem. And he greets him, Yohanan ben Zakkai, and he says, greetings to you, Caesar. Caesar being the head of the Roman Empire, right? Well, Vespasian was not the Caesar. He was the general at the time. And Vespasian says, how dare you call me Caesar? And Yohanan ben Zakkai says to him, you will be Caesar. And just at that moment, coincidentally enough, a messenger comes along and says that Titus has died and now Vespasian is the new Caesar. Well, Vespasian is really impressed. How did you know this? You are an amazing person. I will give you whatever you want. Now, if the guy had asked for Jerusalem, then he would have been told, you got to be kidding me, right? So he did something more practical. He said, give me Yavne and its sages. Yavne was a town where there were a number of rabbis who studied and, were together. And Vespasian said, okay. And that's, according to the Talmud, and it may be legend, how not only Judaism, but the rabbis were saved. And, there are people in the Talmud who criticize this guy because it's like, well, why didn't he ask for Jerusalem? But I think he knew that that was not practical, that, what was Yavne to this guy, to Vespasian? Nothing. So yeah, okay, take Yavne and its sages, no problem. And so now we have Judaism based on text. So I want to see if there are questions, comments. Yes, Beverly.
I'm just curious, it kind of piqued my interest when you compared what happened then to what's happening now. And in terms of, how do you see it? Because people can't congregate in what do you see?
Oh,
as what's
okay,
happening?
thank you for asking me to clarify that. So we have to come up with another paradigm for a few reasons. One is the country at this point is not very religious, right? And the growing number of people is people who identify with no religion. Or they might say I'm spiritual, but not religious, meaning I'm not disconnected from spirituality, but I just don't want to be part of organized religion. Or, I don't know if I want to join an institution. I'd like to study, but there's this group meeting at Starbucks, once a month, and then there's another group somewhere else. And now that all this stuff is online, I can just get online and study with somebody in London or wherever, right?
Mhm.
So, people are not interested in the old paradigm of, you have a synagogue, you join, you send your kids to religious school, they have a bar mitzvah, that's just not anymore the way it works. Now with the pandemic and are being forced to be online, we've multiplied the number of options that people have, which they had before, but now even more so. And the same thing's going on in the Christian church. There are
Mhm.
churches that close every single week.
Mhm.
So what are we going to do to be relevant to people?
Mhm.
The older people in our congregation are perfectly happy with what we're doing, right? Because that's what they're used to. But, ask somebody who's 25 if they want to, join a temple. And if they want to pay dues and be members. So we're trying to reimagine what all of this is about, what synagogue is about, what Judaism is about. There are a lot of experiments going on out there. The other couple of, it's not exactly the same radical paradigm shift, but, the Hasmoneans fought against any kind of bringing Hellenistic ideas into Judaism, and they succeeded at the time. But Reform Judaism brought the Enlightenment into Judaism and really shifted things. It's not, again, not the kind of paradigm shift we're talking about going from a temple cult to a written document, but it still is, a big change to how things, have been done traditionally. So we haven't really gotten there yet in Judaism today. There are lots of experiments, but synagogues are very resistant to change. Did I ever tell you the joke about how many Jews it takes to change a light bulb? So there are a lot of answers, okay? But one of them is, what? You want to change the light bulb? My grandmother gave us that light bulb.
Yeah.
And there you have it in one little joke, very resistant to change. People don't like change, right? And they don't do it unless they're absolutely forced to. Brandon.
And this is something that I've had to deal with my religious experience, is because, as you were mentioning, I'm 25 and this is something we're dealing with. I see a radicalization of people who are either very, very religious or not religious at all, and trying to find how to manage the middle of the road. That's something that people around my age are trying to find out how to do within the way society is now.
Right. And, you know, we haven't really come up with some places have come up with better ways. There are things like, you know, Sinai Temple in LA, which is in Westwood. It's a conservative temple. Rabbi David Wolpe is the senior rabbi. So this is many years ago. Like, you know, they started this about 20 years ago. They started doing something called Friday Night Live. So they brought in Craig Taubman, who is, I don't think he's an ordained cantor, but he's, you know, very musically knowledgeable, and he's written a lot of material that we now use in synagogue worship. So he came in, and David Wolpe, you know, is still relatively young compared to me anyway, but he was even younger 20 years ago, and he's a good looking guy and he's very charming. And so they did a service where, you know, the service was kind of truncated. He would give a very short little sermonette, and Craig Taubman and his band would play all this incredible music. And they would get 1,500 people on a Friday night. You know, it's a bigger temple than ours, and it's LA, but still, you know. And then they would, after services, they would have, like, you know, sit around the table and talk to the rabbi, and folk dancing and food and whatever. I don't know if they still have it, because Craig Taubman has started his own thing in LA, but but that was that was one of the earlier experiments. San Francisco Temple Emmanuel did something like that. It was a service. You actually weren't allowed to show up if you were over 40. And so it was, yeah. And they would serve beer and sandwiches afterwards.
They have that with jazz and mimosas and everything up at Temple Emmanuel for their young adult program. I mean,
Right.
It was funny. They would bring in musicians, and they would do jazz nights, and they would do different mixed drink cocktail hours. And it was, they had a lot going on there.
Yeah. So, you know, various places have tried different ways of attracting younger people. But that's already old by now. You know, they were doing that years ago. The question is, what are we doing today? It doesn't mean we don't do some of that, but there's a lot of other ways of thinking about what a synagogue is. So it's 3:00 now. You know, if anybody, we covered a huge amount of ground. If you're confused or whatever, feel free to reach out to me, email, calls, meetings. I'm happy to try to make it clearer. But I hope that this gave you some sense of, oh, Shay's still driving, my God. Okay, so Chag Sameach is what we say, which is happy holiday. Hope to see some of you, if not all, at our Seder tonight. It'll be about an hour and a half. And there's a meditation at 4:00 before that, if you want to join. Tiffany, did you have a question?
No, I was just gonna say, we will be there. Hopefully this traffic lets up. It keeps adding 20 minutes, like every 10 minutes.
Oh, I know. My mother-in-law is just coming from Las Vegas also. And you know, yeah.
But we plan to be there.
Okay, good. All right. I'll see you all soon.
Okay.
Take care. Have a good week.
Chag Sameach. Bye,
Chag
everyone.
Sameach.
Everyone.
Bye.